The parchment tax notice was already half signed, the wax seal warming soft under Eli Crawford's thumb, when he tore it clean in half instead. "You will not fine her," he said, and his voice did not shake, though his hands wanted to. Warden Garrick Thorne's mouth twisted like he'd bitten into a green apple. "That is not your decision to make, Toll Man. The Cinder Watch has authority over every crossing at Blackthorn Pass, and that authority says an armed orc hauling unregistered goods pays triple, plus a vagrancy fine for walking the King's Road after dark. It is not dark. It is barely past noon." Eli set the torn halves of the notice down on his desk, weighting them beneath the little iron scale he used to measure coin. Behind him the wind came up cold off the sea, carrying the smell of brine and wood smoke from Saltmere Cove far below, where the fishing boats sat like black commas against the gray water. "And she has paid the standing toll. Furs, smoked meat, 2 barrels of salt fish. I have weighed it myself. There is no vagrancy here, Warden. There is only a woman trying to trade." The woman in question stood beside her mule cart with her arms folded, watching the 2 men argue over her, as though she were a sack of grain being haggled between merchants. She was taller than either man by half a head, with skin the deep mottled green of river stone and tusks that curved neat and pale from her lower jaw. Her hair was black and braided back in 3 thick ropes threaded with small bone beads, and she wore fitted travel leathers, a laced bodice of dark tanned hide over a linen underlayer, cinched tight at the waist with a wide belt that carried a skinning knife and a coil of rope. The leather had been oiled to a soft sheen, and fit her like it had been cut for no other body but hers, showing the strong lines of her shoulders and the curve of her waist beneath a short fur-trimmed cloak clasped at the throat with a carved antler pin. Her name, Eli would learn within the hour, was Vrogash Grimtusk, and she was watching him with an expression he could not quite place. Not gratitude, something more wary than that, something closer to disbelief. "Toll Man," Thorne said again, stepping closer, close enough that Eli could smell the wine on his breath even at this hour, "you forget your place. I could write you into this ledger as an accomplice to smuggling. I could have you stripped of your post by sundown." "Then write it," Eli said. "But you will not touch her goods, and you will not touch her, not while I hold this desk." It was, he would think later, the single bravest thing he had done in 11 years of quiet, careful living, and he had done it for a woman whose name he did not yet know, because the alternative watching Thorne's men drag her cart apart plank by plank while she stood there with her jaw set, and her pride the only armor she had left, had been simply unbearable to him, in a way he did not have words for yet. Thorne's men, 4 of them in the black and dash livery of the Cinder Watch, exchanged uncertain looks. They were used to fear opening doors for them. They were not used to a border toll collector, a man with no sword, no rank, nothing but a desk and a ledger and a strongbox standing in their way and refusing to move. "This is not finished," Thorne said at last, and spat near Eli's boot and turned on his heel, his men falling in behind him like dogs called to heel. They rode back down the switchback road toward Saltmere Cove, and the sound of hooves on stone faded into the wind and the far crash of surf against the cliffs below the pass. Eli let out a breath he had not known he was holding. "You did not have to do that," Vrogash said. Her voice was low, rough at the edges, and she had not moved from beside her cart. "I know," Eli said. "He will remember your face. I imagine he will." She studied him a long moment, her dark eyes moving over his weathered coat, his sun-browned face, the gray already threading through the brown hair at his temples, though he could not have been much past 35. He was not a large man, not soft, either years on the mountain line had put a wiry strength into him, but beside her he looked almost slight, and he knew it, and did not care. "Why," she said finally, "would a human risk his post for an orc he has never met?" Eli considered the question honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. "Because the law says you owe a fair toll and you paid it. Anything past that is just cruelty wearing the law's coat. I have collected tolls on this pass for 4 years, Miss Grimtusk. I have never once seen the accord actually say what Thorn claims it says." He paused. "And because it was wrong. That is the whole of it. It was wrong, and I was standing here and I could stop it." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, there and gone. She inclined her head, a small, deliberate motion, and began leading her mule forward onto the coastal road that switched back down toward Saltmere Cove. "Grimtusk," she said over her shoulder without turning. "You will remember it. I intend to cross this pass again." "I never forget a name," Eli said, and meant it more than he let on. He watched her go until the cart disappeared around the first bend of gray rock, and then he sat back down at his desk beneath its little lean-to roof, and found that his hands, now that there was no one to see them, were shaking after all. The toll post at Blackthorn Pass was a lonely place to make a living, which was exactly why Eli had taken the position 4 years ago, after a bad fall on the mountain line had shattered his ankle and ended a decade of trapping in the high country above Saltmere Cove. He had grown used to solitude in those trapping years, to weeks at a stretch with no company but his snares and the wind, and the toll post, though it put him in the path of travelers, had not much cured the habit. He lived in a small stone hut behind the desk, ate simply, kept his ledgers in careful, patient hand, and went down into the village only when supplies ran short. The men of Saltmere Cove thought him strange for it. The women thought him sad. He supposed both were a little true, though he had never let himself dwell on it too long. A man got used to the shape of his own life, the way water got used to the shape of its riverbed, and stopped noticing the banks. He noticed the gift 3 mornings later. It was sitting square in the middle of his desk when he unlocked the strongbox at first light. A fish hook carved from whale bone, delicately barbed, threaded on a leather cord, small enough to sit in his palm. There was no note. There did not need to be one. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him with its speed, exactly whose hands had shaped it and left it there in the dark while he slept 20 feet away in his hut. He turned it over in his fingers for a long while before he tied the cord around his own wrist, beneath his shirt cuff, where no one would see it but him. She crossed again 8 days after that, this time with a heavier cart bundled furs, kegs of pickled roots, 2 crates of the strange black-shelled mountain oysters the Ashfang clan harvested from high cold streams and prized above gold. Thorn was not at the checkpoint this time, only Eli, and when Vrogash reined in her mule she did not bother pretending the visit was purely about commerce. "You wear it," she said, nodding at his wrist, where the leather cord had slipped just visible past his cuff. "I do," Eli admitted, feeling his ears go warm. "It is finely made. I have never seen bone worked so smooth. My clan has fished cold water since before your kind built this road," she said, not unkindly, more the way one states weather. "We know how to make a thing that will not fail you." She held his gaze a beat too long for the words to be only about fish hooks, and Eli felt something low in his chest turn over slow and warm, like a stone rolling in a riverbed. He weighed her goods, wrote the toll fair and square in his ledger, and when she paid it she pressed one more thing into his hand before she took up the mule's lead again, a strip of dried smoked salmon, dark red and glistening with fat, wrapped in a twist of oiled paper. "For your supper," she said. "You look thin, toll man." "Eli," he said. "Eli Crawford." "Eli Crawford," she repeated, testing the shape of it in her mouth, and something about the way she said it made his pulse thicken in his throat. "I will remember it." She came again 3 weeks later, and then again after that, the visits falling into an unspoken rhythm neither of them named aloud. Each time there was some small thing left at his desk. A carved wooden charm shaped like a running fox, a hunting knife with a worked antler hilt too fine for daily use, a jar of dark honey harvested from wild mountain hives. Each time he found some small way to give something back. He mended a cracked wheel spoke on her cart with wire and patience, while she watched with her arms crossed and an expression of grudging approval. He waved the toll on a load of firewood, she carried down for an old widow in Saltmere Cove who could not afford her own. He taught her, one long slow afternoon while trade was thin, the particular knot the harbor fishermen used to lash crab pots, because she had asked, genuinely curious, and he had found himself wanting very badly to be useful to her in whatever small way he could. They talked, in those afternoons at the pass, about things that mattered and things that did not. She told him about the Ashfang clan's high camp 2 days' walk beyond the mountain crest, about her mother who led the clan's council of elders, about the cold rivers where she had learned to spear fish before she could properly walk. He told her about the trapping years, the winters so cold his breath had frozen to his beard, the particular loneliness of a life spent mostly with no one to talk to but the wind. Neither of them spoke of what was growing between them, though it grew regardless, the way grass grows up through stone if given enough seasons and enough stubbornness. But even as the space between Eli's desk and Vrogash's cart grew warmer, the space between Saltmere Cove and the wider world grew colder. It began, as these things often did, with fear dressed up as faith. The herring runs failed that spring failed entirely, the harbor nets coming up empty week after week, the black-shelled crabs vanishing from the tide pools, a strange gray film spreading across the water at the harbor mouth that the fishermen called the black tide and would not touch with bare hands. Hunger crept into Saltmere Cove the way damp creeps into a hull, slow and then sudden, and hunger looked for someone to blame. The Cinder Watch, under Warden Marshal Garrick Thorne, was only too glad to give it a target. Within a month there were sermons preached from the steps of the harbor chapel about the marked, a word that meant orcs, meant the rare half-bloods who lived quietly at the edges of the village, meant the old widow who read fortunes in fish bones, meant anyone whose blood or manner did not sit comfortably within the narrow lines Thorne drew. The black tide, the sermon said, was a curse, and curses came from cursed things, and cursed things must be found and burned out before they spread. Eli heard the sermon secondhand, from merchants passing through his checkpoint with their faces drawn tight and frightened, and felt a cold dread settle into his stomach that did not lift. He tried to warn her. On her next crossing he pulled her aside from the road, out of earshot of the other travelers, and told her plainly what was building in the village below. "Do not go into the market square," he said. "Not until this passes. Send word ahead, trade at the harbor gate only, do not linger." Vrogash's jaw set hard. "I have traded in that square for 6 years, Eli Crawford. I will not be run from it by a man in a black coat shouting scripture he does not believe. This is not pride, Vrogash. This is a mob with torches waiting for a reason. Then I will not give them one." But he saw, beneath the defiance, that she had heard him and was afraid despite herself, and it was the fear more than the pride that frightened him most. She did not heed the warning fully. She never went anywhere quietly. It was not in her nature. And 2 weeks later, on a gray morning thick with the smell of low tide, Eli came down the switchback road to the harbor market on some pretext of restocking lamp oil and found her surrounded. They had thrown rotten fish first, the crowd had, splattering the fine oiled leather of her bodice with gray slime and scales, and now they were closing in a slow, ugly ring around her cart, a dozen villagers with faces twisted by fear into something meaner than they likely were in their own homes at night. Warden Thorne stood at the ring's edge, not touching her, simply watching, letting the crowd do the work his rank would not let him do outright, a small satisfied smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "Curse bringer," someone shouted. "Black tide walks on 2 green legs. Send her back over the mountain, send them all back." Vrogash stood with her back against her cart, knife drawn, not raised to strike, only held, a warning, and Eli saw in her face something that broke his heart clean through. Not fear of the mob's fists, which she could likely have weathered, but the old, deep weariness of someone who had spent a lifetime being made to answer for things she had never done. He did not think. He simply walked into the ring. "Enough," he said, and put himself between her and the nearest raised hand, close enough that he could feel the heat of her at his back, close enough to smell wood smoke and leather and the salt of the sea on her skin. She has done nothing. The black tide came from the water, not from her blood. You know this. You are frightened, and I understand it, but you are aiming your fear at the wrong door. Step aside, tall man, someone called. This is none of your affair. It is entirely my affair, Eli said, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the square. I have collected honest toll from this woman for the better part of a year. I have seen her pay fair, trade fair, and harm no one. If you want to burn something for the black tide, burn the nets that came up empty. Do not burn a person because her face is easier to hate than the sea. The crowd wavered, uncertain now, the way crowds do when a single voice refuses to bend. Thorne's smile had curdled into something uglier. You will regret this, Crawford, he said, soft enough only Eli and Vrogash could hear it. Perhaps, Eli said, but I will not regret it more than I would regret standing by. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering, unsatisfied but unwilling to test a fight in the open square with witnesses watching from doorways. Vrogash sheathed her knife with a hand that was not quite steady, and when Eli finally turned to face her, he found her staring at him with an expression that made his breath catch. You should not have done that, she said, low. I have said that to you before, he said, and meant it just as little. She reached out then before he could stop her, before either of them could talk themselves out of it, and cupped his jaw in one broad green hand, calloused from bowstring and blade, gentler than he would have believed such a hand could be. No one has stood in front of me before, Eli Crawford, not once, not in my whole life. Then it was past time someone did, he said, and his voice was rough now too. She kissed him there in the emptying square, fish scales still clinging to her bodice, the smell of low tide and fear still hanging in the air, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was hungry, fierce, a year of careful looks and small gifts breaking open all at once, and Eli kissed her back with both hands fisted in the front of her leathers like he might fall if he let go. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing small enough to say. This will not be simple, Vrogash said finally. No, Eli agreed. I do not imagine it will. I do not want simple, she said, and there was a fierceness in it that steadied something in his chest that had been unsteady his whole life. I want you. I have wanted you since you tore that notice, and I am too old to pretend otherwise. Then you have me, Eli said. You have had me for longer than you know. The trouble was that wanting each other did not make the cinder watch any less dangerous, and within a fortnight, Thorne's sermons had sharpened into something with teeth. A tribunal was called, the first in Saltmere Cove's memory, to be held in the village hall, to try the marked for the crime of cursing the harbor. Eli heard of it from a frightened merchant who begged toll relief, because trade had dried up entirely, everyone too afraid to travel while the watch combed the coast for the accused. He rode down to the village that same evening, boots slipping on wet stone in his haste, and found Vrogash's name already posted on the tribunal notice nailed to the chapel door, her crime listed as consorting with the curse and inciting rebellion against the watch. She was to be tried in 3 days. He found her camped in a sea cave a mile north of the harbor, where she had been hiding since word of the tribunal reached her mule tethered deeper in the rocks, a small fire burning low enough not to be seen from the cliff road above. She did not look surprised to see him, only tired, the fine lines of worry sitting strange on a face built for fearlessness. You should not have come, she said. If they follow you, they will not. He knelt beside her fire, close enough that their knees touched. Vrogash. Leave tonight, go back over the pass, back to your clan. They cannot try you if they cannot find you. And leave you here to answer for helping me. Her eyes flashed. No. I will not run and let you carry the cost of my running. I am not asking you to save me. I am asking you to save yourself. There is no saving myself that does not include you, she said simply, as though it were the most obvious fact in the world, and something in Eli's chest cracked wide open at the plainness of it. I have run from things before, Eli Crawford. I did not run from that crowd in the square. I will not run from this either, not if it means leaving you to face Thorne alone. Then we go together, he said, But not into that hall, not into their trap. They already hold 3 others from the village, the widow who reads bones, a half-blood boy no older than 16, an old fisherman whose grandmother was born beyond the mountains. If I run, they die in my place, made examples of instead of me. I cannot have that on my hands, Eli. I will not. He wanted to argue. He wanted, more than he had wanted almost anything, to simply take her by the hand and run north into the dark and never look back at Saltmere Cove again. But he understood, looking at the set of her jaw in the firelight, that this was a woman who had never once let fear choose her path, and he loved her too much. The word arrived in his mind fully formed, and he did not flinch from it, to ask her to become someone smaller than herself now. "Then I will be in that hall," he said, "beside you, whatever comes." She reached across the small fire and took his hand, and they sat like that a long while, saying nothing more, the sea sighing against the rocks outside the cave mouth, until the fire burned down to coals and the night wrapped close and warm around them both. The village hall of Saltmere Cove was built for perhaps 200 souls and held closer to 400 on the morning of the tribunal, packed shoulder to shoulder along its timber walls, lanterns guttering in iron brackets against the gray daylight leaking through high narrow windows. Warden Marshal Garrick Thorne stood on the raised dais at the hall's far end, black coat immaculate, a ceremonial dagger with a hilt of blackened iron resting in a velvet-lined case on the table before him. The cinder watch's instrument for what they called cleansing, though everyone in that hall knew the word for what it truly meant. Vrogash stood before the dais with her wrists bound in iron, flanked by 2 watch guardsmen, her chin lifted, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Eli pressed near the front and held there. The widow was tried first and condemned in minutes on the strength of a neighbor's grudge. The half-blood boy next, weeping, too young to understand why his blood alone was evidence enough. Eli's stomach turned to stone watching it, watching the crowd's fear curdle into something that cheered at cruelty, because cheering felt safer than doubting. Then it was Vrogash's turn, and Thorne rose from his seat with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who had waited a long while for this moment. "Vrogash Grimtusk," he intoned, "accused of consorting with dark powers, of bringing the black tide upon this harbor, and of inciting a border official to abandon his sworn duty. How do you answer?" "I answer that the sea does not care what shape a person's ears take," Vrogash said, clear and steady, her voice carrying to the back of the hall. "I answer that your black tide came the same season a mine upriver began dumping its tailings into the water that feeds this harbor, and that you have not once sent your watch to inspect that mine, because the man who owns it sits on your own council. I answer that you are frightened of things you do not understand, and it is easier to burn me than to burn the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not agreement, not yet, but the first crack of doubt, and Thorne's composure slipped just enough for Eli to see the fear beneath the fury. "Silence her," Thorne snapped, and one of the guardsmen struck Vrogash across the face with the back of his gauntlet, hard enough that she staggered, blood welling at the corner of her mouth. Eli was moving before he had decided to move, shouldering through the packed bodies toward the dais. "Stop this. She has committed no crime but speaking truth you do not wish to hear." "Ah," Thorne said, turning his attention to Eli with something close to delight. "The toll man returns. Perfect. Let the record show that Eli Crawford, sworn officer of the Border Toll, has now twice interfered in the lawful business of the Cinder Watch on behalf of the accused. I think we have found our second traitor for the morning." He crossed to the velvet case and drew the ceremonial dagger free, its blackened iron catching the lantern light dull and cold, and stepped down from the dais toward Vrogash, who stood bound and bleeding but unbowed, her eyes never leaving Eli's face. "Let this be the lesson Saltmere Cove remembers," Thorne said, raising the blade. "The watch does not suffer curses, and it does not suffer those who protect them." The blade came down toward Vrogash's bound wrists, not her throat. Eli would understand later. Only a maiming meant to break her, to make an example that could scream and bleed and still live to remind the crowd of its own fear. But in that instant none of that mattered, because all Eli could see was the knife falling toward the woman he loved, and he threw himself forward with a shout that tore his throat raw, throwing his own body into the blade's path. The iron bit into his shoulder instead of her wrist, a white-hot line of fire that dropped him to his knees on the hall's timber floor, blood welling dark and fast through his coat. The crowd screamed, a sound like a wave breaking, chaos erupting on every side, bodies surging toward the dais and away from it in equal panicked measure. And in the confusion, Vrogash wrenched against her bindings with a strength born of pure fury. The iron cuffs, never meant to hold an orc woman at the edge of losing everything she loved, groaning, and then splitting at the rivet. She was on Thorn before he could raise the blade again, one hand closing around his wrist hard enough to crack bone, the dagger clattering free across the floor. She did not kill him. Eli would only understand the restraint of that later, how much fury she had swallowed to leave the man breathing, but she struck him once, brutal and final, and Thorn crumpled senseless at the foot of his own dais. Eli. She was at his side in an instant, hauling him up against her with an arm like iron, his blood soaking warm through both their clothes. Eli, look at me, stay with me. I am here, he managed, though the world had gone strange and gray at the edges. I am here, Vrogash, go. We have to go around them. The hall had descended into full pandemonium. Guardsmen shouting contradictory orders, villagers shoving toward the doors, the widow and the half-blood boy being dragged free of their bonds by their own kin in the confusion, no one quite able to agree who was meant to be stopping whom. Vrogash swept Eli up bodily, careless of the pain it must have cost her arms and back, and carried him through a side door into the gray daylight before anyone thought to give chase, running with him cradled against her chest down toward the tree line above the harbor road, while the hall behind them roared with confusion, turning slowly, inevitably, toward pursuit. The days that followed blurred into a single long ache of salt wind and stone underfoot. Vrogash carried him, when he could not walk, along goat tracks that clung to the wild rocky coast north of Saltmere Cove, cliffs dropping sheer into white-churned surf on one side, black pine forest climbing steep on the other. She packed his wound with crushed yarrow and moss when they paused, bound it tight with strips torn from her own cloak, cursed at him in the ash-fang tongue when he tried to insist he could walk farther than he could, and carried him again when he proved himself wrong. They slept in the lee of wind-carved boulders, in a fisherman's abandoned drying shed that smelled of old brine, once in a sea cave where the tide came close enough at high water that they had to sit wakeful and wary through half the night. Twice they heard watch patrols on the cliff road above, torches bobbing in the dark, voices calling Eli's name and Vrogash's like a hunting cry, and both times Vrogash went utterly, deadly still, one hand pressed flat over Eli's mouth though he had made no sound, her whole body curved protective around his as they waited pressed into shadow until the torches passed. On the third night, with his shoulder healing clean but slow and the immediate danger of the patrols fallen away behind them, they made camp in a hidden cove where a freshwater stream met the sea, sheltered from the wind by a horseshoe of black rock, and for the first time since the tribunal hall, there was space enough between them and their pursuers to simply breathe. Vrogash built the fire small and careful, checked his shoulder by its light with fingers gentler than he had known such strong hands could be, and when she was satisfied the wound was healing true, she did not pull away. "You could have died," she said, quiet, not looking at him, staring instead into the fire. "For me. A woman you had known less than a year." "I would do it again," Eli said. "I do not say that lightly, Vrogash. I have thought of little else these 3 days but how close that blade came, and I would still do it again without hesitation because the alternative was watching them hurt you, and I cannot, I will not survive watching that happen while I stand by and do nothing." She turned to look at him then, fire like gold across the green plains of her face, and there were tears standing unshed in her dark eyes, the first he had ever seen there. "In my clan," she said slowly, "when a warrior offers their body between another and harm and means it and would do it again, we have a word for that. It is not a small word. It is not spoken carelessly." "Tell me," Eli said. "Nakash," she said. "It means chosen shield. It means the one whose life is bound to yours by their own free choice, not by blood, not by law, but by the offering of their own body in your place. My mother named my father this word 40 years past before he died defending her camp from raiders. She has never spoken it again to another living soul." "And you," Eli said, throat tight, "are you speaking it to me?" "I am asking," Vrogash said, "if you will let me." He reached up with his good arm and drew her down to him. And this time when they kissed, there was no hunger of fear or grief behind it. Only the slow, deliberate warmth of two people who had already decided, without needing to say it aloud, exactly what they intended to build together. She was careful of his wounded shoulder, even as her hands found the buttons of his coat, even as his fingers worked loose the laces of her bodice, with a patience that made her breath catch, and her name spill from his mouth like a prayer he had been saving his whole life to say. The fire burned low and gold beside them. The sea murmured against the black rocks of the cove, and the world outside that small circle of warmth, Thorn, the watch, the tribunal, all of it fell away entirely, if only for that one long, unhurried night, into something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, entirely and only like home. They stayed 3 days in the hidden cove, waiting for Eli's shoulder to knit strong enough for the road ahead, and when they finally moved on, it was toward a destination they had settled on together in the low firelit hours. Duskhaven, the free port 2 hard weeks north along the coast, a harbor city built on old treaty ground, where humans and orcs and half-bloods traded side by side under a harbor council sworn to no crown and no creed but fair trade and fair law. The road there was not gentle. They crossed a rope bridge strung across a gorge, so deep the bottom vanished into mist, the old planks groaning under their combined weight, Vrogash going first and steady, while Eli's stomach lurched with every sway, her hand gripping his wrist the entire crossing, as though she could will the bridge to hold by sheer force of refusal to lose him now. They were nearly caught twice more by roving patrols, once hiding submerged to the chin in a tidal pool while boots crunched along the shingle above them, once trading Eli's good boots and half their remaining coin to a fisherman willing to run them 2 days up the coast in his boat rather than risk the cliff road at all. The little craft pitching hard through a squall that soaked them both to the bone and left Vrogash gripping the gunwale white-knuckled, admitting for the first time since Eli had known her that there was, in fact, one thing in this world that frightened her more than any tribunal. "I do not care for boats," she said through gritted teeth as the little vessel crested another wave, and Eli, despite everything, laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, and she glared at him and then, unable to help herself, laughed too, and the sound of it over the storm did more to warm him than any fire could have. They reached Duskhaven on the 14th day, cresting the last headland at dawn to see the harbor spread below them. A proper city, stone-walled, its docks crowded with ships flying a dozen different banners, orc longhouses and human timber halls standing shoulder to shoulder along streets busy with trade in a way Saltmere Cove had never managed even in its best seasons. Green-skinned dockhands hauled cargo alongside human sailors without a second glance passing between them. It looked to Eli's tired eyes almost like a dream. "This is real?" he asked. "My mother's clan has traded here for 3 generations," Vrogash said. "It is real. Whether it will welcome us as we are, that is a different question." The Harbor Council of Duskhaven met in a long stone hall built out over the water on pilings, its windows open to the sea air, and it took 2 days of waiting and one favor called in from an Ashfang trading cousin before Eli and Vrogash were granted an audience before its 7 members. 3 human merchants, 2 orc clan elders, a half-blood harbor master, and an old sea captain of no fixed loyalty who chaired the table. "You are asking," said the sea captain, a weathered woman named Aldous Ferris. Once Eli had laid out their situation plainly, the tribunal, the flight, the price on both their heads that would surely follow them even here for sanctuary. That is not so simple a thing to grant a fugitive of the Cinder Watch, toll man. Saltmere Cove sits within the same trade compact as this port. Refusing to return you could cost this council its herring rights along that coast for a decade. "I am not only asking for sanctuary," Eli said, and here was the gamble he had turned over in his mind the whole length of the coast road, the only card he had left to play. "I am offering something in trade. I collected honest toll at Blackthorn Pass for 4 years. I know the accord's true wording better than any warden who has ever twisted it. I know where every unfair tariff on orc goods hides in that treaty's fine print. Every loophole Thorn and men like him have used to bleed traders like Vrogash's clan for a generation. Give us sanctuary, and let me serve this port as an impartial toll master. Draft a fair trade charter between Duskhaven and the Ashfang clan, and every clan beyond the mountains who wishes to trade honestly. I will bring you more revenue and fair, steady trade than you would ever wring from a corrupt toll levied on fear. And you will have done a truer justice than handing 2 innocent people back to a man who tried to murder a bound prisoner in his own tribunal hall." Silence settled over the council table. The 2 orc elders exchanged a long look. One of them, an old woman with tusks yellowed by age and a face seemed like weathered bark, leaned forward. "You are Grimtusk," she said to Vrogash. "Ashfang blood. Sarn Grimtusk's daughter." "I am," Vrogash said, chin lifted. "Your mother's clan has never once cheated a Duskhaven ledger in 30 years of trade," the elder said. "That is worth more to this council than any watch tribunal's word." She turned to the sea captain. "I will vouch for the clan's good faith, Aldous, and I will say plainly what none of you wish to. A toll master who tore up a false fine rather than fleece a woman for her blood is worth 10 who only ever collect what they are told to collect." The debate that followed was long and sharp in places, the human merchants worrying openly over Saltmere Cove's reaction, the harbor master pointing out with a dry humor that eased the room that Duskhaven had never once in its history let another town's fear dictate its own laws, and did not intend to start now. In the end, it was Aldous Ferris who called the vote, and it was Aldous Ferris who delivered the verdict. "Sanctuary is granted," she said, "to Vrogash Grimtusk of the Ashfang clan and Eli Crawford, late of Blackthorn Pass, on this condition: that Eli Crawford take up the post of toll master for this harbor within 1 turn of the moon, and draft, with the aid of the Ashfang elders present, a fair trade charter binding this port to every clan of the northern mountains on equal terms. Fail that task, and the sanctuary lapses. Succeed, and you are both citizens of Duskhaven from this day, beyond the reach of any watch tribunal south of this harbor's walls." Eli felt Vrogash's hand find his beneath the table, gripping tight, and he gripped back just as hard, and did not trust his voice enough to speak until the council chamber had emptied and they stood alone at last on the harbor's stone quay, the morning sun breaking gold across the water. "We did it," he said finally, disbelief and joy tangled together in his chest. "You did it," Vrogash said. "I only carried you when your legs gave out." But she was smiling, a real smile, wide and unguarded, tusks bright in the sunlight, the first he had seen from her since before the tribunal, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything so beautiful. Word reached them a month later, carried up the coast by a trading cog out of Saltmere Cove, that Warden Marshal Garrick Thorn had been stripped of his rank and driven from the village entirely. The tribunal's brutality, once the black tide's true cause, was traced back plainly to the upriver mine's tailings, just as Vrogash had said, had turned the villagers' fear into fury of an entirely different direction, and Thorn had fled south in the night, rather than face the crowd he had once commanded so easily. The widow who read fish bones and the half-blood boy had both been quietly released, The tribunal's charges against them dropped, the hall itself given over to a new town council that had, in its first act, formally apologized to the Ashfang clan and reopened honest trade at Blackthorn Pass under a toll collector Eli had personally trained and trusted before he left. Eli drafted the Duskhaven trade charter through the long autumn that followed, working late into candle-lit evenings at a proper desk in a proper harbor office. Vrogash often seated across from him, sharpening her knives or mending nets while he worked, occasionally leaning over his shoulder to correct a clause the elders would find fault with, occasionally simply resting her chin atop his head while he wrote, content to be near him and nothing more. When the charter was finally signed by the Harbor Council, by 3 visiting clan chiefs including Vrogash's own mother, who arrived by mountain road with an honor guard of a dozen Ashfang warriors, and studied Eli with a long, appraising look before pronouncing him, with obvious reluctance and equally obvious approval, adequate. It was celebrated with a feast on the harbor quay that lasted long into the night. Humans and orcs sharing tables and songs, and firelight in a way Saltmere Cove had never once managed. It was at that feast, with lanterns strung between the mooring posts and the sea calm and silver under a full moon, that Vrogash drew Eli aside from the noise and laughter, down to the quiet end of the quay where the water lapped soft against old pilings, and pressed into his hands a final gift, not carved bone or smoked salmon this time, but a simple iron ring, hammered flat and etched with a pattern of running waves, clearly Ashfang work, clearly made with careful hands over many patient hours. "This is not our custom," she said, suddenly, uncharacteristically uncertain, turning the words over slow. "Your people wed with rings, I have learned since coming here. My people mark a bond differently, a scar shared, a vow spoken before the clan fire. But I have thought long on this, Eli Crawford, and I find I do not care whose custom we borrow, only that you understand what I mean by it. I am asking you to be mine, not chosen shield only, though you are that and always will be. I am asking you to be the one I choose, before any council, any clan, any crowd, the one whose desk I will leave gifts on for the rest of both our lives, because I have never once, in all my years, wanted to give anything to another living soul the way I want to give everything to you." Eli's throat was too tight for a long moment to answer properly. When he finally could, his voice came out rough and sure. "I refused to fine you the first day I met you," he said, "because it was wrong to hurt you, and I could not stand by and let it happen. I did not know then that refusing that fine would be the first small act of loving you. I know it now. I have known it for a long while." He closed her hand around the ring, then opened his own collar to show her the small whalebone fish hook still hanging on its worn cord against his chest, where it had hung every single day since she first left it on his desk. "I have carried the first gift you ever gave me every day since. I intend to carry every gift after it the same way, for as long as you will let me." She kissed him then, there at the quiet end of the quay with the feast's laughter drifting warm behind them and the sea moving black and silver under the moon, and slid the iron ring onto his finger herself, and he slid its twin, for she had made 2, of course she had made 2, careful and unshowy in the way of a woman who never did anything by half measure, onto her own scarred and calloused hand. They stayed in Duskhaven together after that, in a stone house near the harbor with a proper toll office below and rooms above, and Eli kept his desk, fair and honest as he had always kept it, and Vrogash kept crossing paths with that desk for the rest of both their lives, not as a trader paying toll now, but as a woman who still, on quiet mornings when the mood took her, left some small gift there before he woke. A carved charm, a strip of good salmon, once simply a single wildflower from the cliffs above the harbor, tucked beneath the iron scale where he would find it first thing, and smile, and know exactly whose hands had left it there, and love her a little more than he had the morning before, which he had not thought possible, and which happened anyway again and again, for every morning that followed.